Chuck, I'm so thankful and grateful that you took us through a really complicated picture and gave us a sort of framework to hang it all on. And thank you for that. I think one of the things that makes me tremble, I was thinking about this psalm and I'm like, why am I so trembling reading these words? And as you were talking about the role of the law and justice and the idea of these permanent principles given by God that ought to rule us. I think one of the things that popped into my mind for why I might be trembling is
Welcome to Generous Theology. Today, Chuck and Brock talk about Psalm 50.
I think that maybe sometimes what I might do and what other people might do as well is I think we might take something like God's law and instead of looking up to it, instead of having a reverence towards it, instead of seeing it as something that stands in judgment over and above us, I think it's a particularly human proclivity to maybe want to take this awesome thing and almost turn it into a pet. So instead of being this thing that sits over and above us, maybe I want to bring it in conceptually into my own mind and maybe just make it like my own pet. Think of those Austin Powers movies with Dr. Evil, and he has his pet cat, his Mr. Bigglesworth, and that pet cat, and he has it on his lap, and he's stroking that little kitty cat, and I almost think that's maybe to some degree what I do and what other people do with God's laws. We turn it into our own little private pet. And it just strikes me that there's something so unwholesome about doing that. And as we see in the rest of the psalm here, I'm going to read, starting with verse 16. I think we get a sense that the people of Israel, the people who God gave his special law to in honor, in trust, and in a high way, I think we're going to see that these people have maybe done something like that. And so let me just start in and read with verse 16 here. But to the wicked person, God says, what have you to recite my laws or take my covenant on your lips? You hate my instruction and cast my words behind you. When you see a thief, you join with him. You throw in your lot with adulterers. You use your mouth for evil and harness your tongue to deceit. You sit and testify against your brother and slander your own mother's son. When you did these things and I kept silent, you thought I was exactly like you. But I now arraign you and set my accusations before you. Consider this, you who forget God, or I will tear you to pieces with no one to rescue you. Those who sacrifice thank offering honor me, and to the blameless I will show my salvation. What an indictment. What an arraignment, to use that sort of legal, procedural language. And so now we have it. God has come out, and in the first part, like you pointed out, he said, I'm not indicting you for the formal religious practices. You didn't violate them. But instead, what did you do? And God cites the evil that he's indicting his people with. And I almost get a sense, Chuck, maybe tell me if you see it differently. I almost get a sense that maybe the people of Israel were almost using the law against God, almost like they were maybe saying in their hearts, oh, I can go and do evil now because I've kept the sacrificial system of the law. And we see God is the aggrieved party here, and the grievance is extreme and it's severe. It's not like God is only slightly perturbed by this. No, this is absolutely criminal. It is terrifying in its violation of wholesome intent. And I think that's part of why I was trembling when I read about this, is I think maybe just how easy it is for me to turn God's own law against him, to make it my pet and serve my schemes and my ideas, maybe rather than to want to serve him. And so my ideas of justice can even turn into a finger point. Hey, Lord, look at my neighbor down there. That neighbor's really upsetting me. Can we strike him down? And little did I realize that the Lord had a much higher purpose than just serving my own partisan interest. And so, what do you think in these last few verses? How does that tie it all in and tie in with what we were talking about here?
Yeah, I agree with you that in many ways, as believers, when we read those last verses 16 to 23, there is a sense that we should be trembling, that we should be convicted, because that verse 16, it says, "But to the wicked, God says, what have you to recite my statutes or to take my covenant on your lips?" Who is God talking to there? He's saying to the wicked, but specifically, who are the wicked? The non believers, they're not typically reciting God's statutes, God's laws. They're not taking his covenant on their lips because they've already rejected all that. God's talking to believers here. He's talking to his covenant people. The wicked, oh my goodness. And that includes us. And I think it includes us because we at times do exactly what you've described. We recite God's statutes, we take God's covenant on our lips, but we don't take it seriously. We turn it into something entirely different than God meant it to be. And so we, as the footnote in my ESV Bible says, we despise the privileges of the covenant. We take the covenant on our lips, but we lack the right to do so. We hate the fatherly discipline that God gives his children, and we forget God, and implying that must have known something of him to begin with. And so if we're forgetting him, he's talking about his people here. The covenant should have brought us together. It should have knit us together with all of God's people in what this footnote calls the great project of showing forth true humanity for the sake of the world. But instead, we have become so fixated on our individual selves, on what we desire, on what we internally desire for ourselves, that we're no longer part of this great project of God to be true humans, but to do for the sake of God's glory, for the sake of the world. And so instead, we prefer the thief and the adulterers. We use our tongues for destructive purposes. And that's three of the commandments right there that come in pretty short. I think that the seventh, eighth, and ninth commandments come there in pretty short order. And so now God is ready to rebuke us. And I find interesting there in verse 21 in the ESV, it gives two alternative ways of reading. It says, "These things you have done, and I have been silent. You thought that I was one like yourself." Oh, and they said that the other way to read that is, "You thought that the I am was one like yourself." And I really like that translation of it, because I think it really hits it home. You thought that I am who I am, the God who revealed himself in the burning bush, the God who created all of creation. You thought that I was like one of you? You thought I was like a human being? No, I am your creator. I am your God. I am bigger than you. I'm larger than you. But not only that, but you're one of my creatures. I created you. And you thought that I was one like yourself? So now I rebuke you, and I lay this charge before you. Mark this then, you who forget God, lest I tear you apart, which God has the right to do, and there be none to deliver. So that's in many ways pretty harsh words that ought to put the fear of God into us. But then there's that last verse, and that last verse brings us a little sense, I think, of comfort. It says, "The one who offers thanksgiving as a sacrifice glorifies me. The one who orders his way rightly, I will show the salvation of God." And here, what we see here is that who is he talking to? He who sacrifices thank offerings honors me. Well, now, before he had said, you do all these things and you're doing them for the wrong reasons. But now he's talking, I think, to another set of believers, a set of his covenant people who have strived to honor God, who strive to stay true to God's word, who strive to do the things that God commands them to do, that sacrificial system in the Old Testament, and righteous living as we think of it today. And so God is reminding the righteous that they're sacrifices, that they're not necessary. God doesn't need them. We don't make these sacrifices. We don't do these things before God as a way of sustaining him, of giving him power. But these things that we do, the sacrifices or these acts of righteousness and justice, they're essential to our own salvation because they're the means through which God applies to us the blessings of salvation. And I think here then, as I read that and think about what replaced the sacrificial system, and one of those things that replaced the sacrificial system is really our concept of the sacraments and in baptism and the Lord's Supper. And these things are the means of grace, the means by which God applies our salvation to his elect people. And so he's saying, yeah, you, my faithful people who make sure to properly engage in these means of grace, to properly engage in the sacraments, I'm still going to be faithful to you, and I will prepare the way. I will show the salvation of God through these things. And so we do have this promise that if we're faithful, then God will be faithful to us. And unlike humans, God is perfectly faithful. He keeps his promises, and he will always be there for his chosen people. I love how after so many verses, 22 verses of a lot of fire and brimstone, a lot of fear, a lot of causing us to tremble, and then we get this promise. But he who sacrifices thank offerings, he who is faithful to me, for him I will prepare the way so that I may show him the salvation of God. And so what a wonderful way to end that psalm.
Chuck, I think, first of all, I completely agree with you. What a joyful note. And as much as I've trembled in the reading of this psalm, there's a light in the midst of this darkness. Yes, I treated God's law as my own pet, as something that I was the master of, rather than it being the master of me. And yes, that was offensive. And we see the people of Israel called out in this psalm for something very similar. But yet, this is the rebuke of the same God who is going to quite literally fix it. He's going to fix what's wrong between him and me. And Chuck, it was all of the fault was on the one side. Let's be clear about that. So this same God who will bring an indictment is the same God who will send the gift of a son to aid us in the time of our greatest distress. And he will bring joy out of our sorrow and out of our shame. And so even as I tremble reading this psalm, I also worship this God. I rejoice in him, and I most especially run to him. Yes, he's the one I offended. Yes, he's the holy God who governs and administers. And yet I'm also going to just run to him. I know from the scriptures, he says, turn to me, come to me, return, and I will save you. And I think that's my comfort in the midst of this. And you and I are going to be celebrating Resurrection Sunday, this coming Sunday, as we're recording this. And I think about that, and there's so much joy. Where sin abounds, grace abounds the more. And Chuck, this journey through this psalm together with you has really fed my soul and fed me, and I hope it does for others too. So I want to say thank you for that. Any last thoughts to close up here for the night?
I just want to repeat that thanks to you for bringing this particular psalm to us today, and for the opportunity to talk about it. There's a real sense, we often talk about a gospel message, right? And sometimes when we think about a gospel message, we're specifically thinking about texts in the New Testament that talk about what Christ has done on our behalf. But we see that gospel message in the Old Testament as well. And if there ever was a gospel psalm, Psalm 50 may be one of those. And it's just amazing how we see that gospel message reflected in a psalm written by the psalmist perhaps 1,000 years before Christ incarnated and came to earth as our Savior, as both fully human and fully God, and died on the cross and then rose again, as we'll be celebrating on Sunday, on Easter Sunday. So, yeah, that gospel message is there, right there in the Psalms, and it's wonderful to see it.